There are probably women in the entertainment industry but the whole industry is that way. It's not just women. I think it's meant the whole thing. When you get into it, it's just different. It's a feast or famine kind of thing.
Clint Eastwood is one of Hollywood's most respected legends, but not everyone could stand him. In fact, some of the biggest names in film history went from admiring his work to outright despising him. And when you hear who made that list, you'll be shocked. John Wayne was already a towering figure in Hollywood when Clint Eastwood first stepped onto the scene. To Wayne, the Western wasn't just a genre, it was a code of honor. His heroes stood tall, fought clean, and never strayed into the shadows of moral doubt. Eastwood, on the other hand, came in swinging with something entirely different. His man with no name wasn't noble or polished. He was ruthless, unpredictable, and carried a darkness that Wayne believed had no place in the myth of the American West. When Eastwood's spaghetti westerns began to dominate the box office, Wayne reportedly bristled. He saw those films as cheap, violent imitations of what the Western should be. To him, Eastwood wasn't carrying the torch of the genre, he was burning it down. Their clash wasn't just personal, it was generational. Wayne represented the clean-cut cowboy of the past, while Eastwood symbolized the gritty anti-hero audiences were suddenly craving. The tension boiled over when Wayne read the script for High Plains Drifter, one of Eastwood's most daring films. Wayne was disgusted by its depiction of a corrupt town and a vengeful drifter who brought justice with fear instead of honor. He even wrote Eastwood a letter, scolding him for what he saw as a complete betrayal of the Western tradition. Eastwood didn't back down. He kept making darker, morally gray stories that redefined the genre. Fans often wondered if the two would ever team up for a once-in-a-lifetime film, but it never happened. The truth? Wayne couldn't bring himself to stand alongside Eastwood on screen. Their visions of the West were too far apart, and neither man was willing to compromise. But as bitter as Wayne felt, he wasn't the only Hollywood icon who clashed with Eastwood. Another legendary actor would go even further, openly mocking him with a single cruel remark that Eastwood never forgot. If John Wayne represented the old-school Western hero, Marlon Brando was Hollywood's ultimate rebel, the actor who rewrote the rules of performance with raw emotion and unpredictable energy. He was a legend in his own right, and like Eastwood, he carved out an image that stood apart from anyone else in the business. But instead of respecting Eastwood's rise, Brando had nothing but disdain for him. The story came out years later when comedian Eddie Murphy revealed a private conversation he once had with Brando. Murphy recalled Brando dismissing Eastwood entirely, saying, "I can't stand that kid with the gun." To Brando, Eastwood wasn't a serious actor, just a squint, a holster, and a few gruff one-liners. For someone like Brando, who built his career on complex, emotional performances, Eastwood's stripped-down stoic style probably looked like a cheap shortcut. But here's where the feud gets interesting. Eastwood never publicly fired back. That's his trademark. He doesn't waste words on critics. He lets the work speak for itself. And while Brando was ridiculing him in private, Eastwood was quietly building a reputation as not only a box office powerhouse, but also a director with a sharp, uncompromising vision. It's almost poetic when you think about it. Brando once defined what it meant to be the most exciting man in Hollywood, but by the time he was mocking Eastwood, his own career had grown inconsistent, weighed down by erratic behavior and personal struggles. Eastwood, meanwhile, was climbing higher and higher, moving from spaghetti westerns to gritty American classics. In the end, Brando's jab didn't slow Eastwood down. If anything, it highlighted the stark divide between the two men. Brando, the unpredictable genius who burned bridges, and Eastwood, the steady force who quietly outlasted almost everyone. But Brando wasn't the only star who found Eastwood hard to stomach. Even actors who worked directly under his direction sometimes walked away frustrated, and the list of names might surprise you. Clint Eastwood built a second career as a director that rivals, and in some ways even surpasses, his acting legacy. But behind the camera, Eastwood isn't known for being warm or chatty. In fact, he's famous for directing in near silence. He doesn't yell, he doesn't give long speeches, and he rarely says, "Cut." Instead, he just lets the camera roll and expects the actors to figure it out on their own. For some performers, this minimalist approach feels liberating, but for others, it's pure torture. Take Tom Hanks, for example. On the set of Sully, Hanks admitted he was shocked by Eastwood's style. Eastwood would start filming without ever calling action. The crew would suddenly realize the cameras were rolling, and the actors had to scramble into the scene without any preparation. Hanks joked that it felt like Eastwood was playing a prank, but underneath the humor, there was clear frustration. For a veteran actor who thrives on structure, Eastwood's unpredictability wasn't a creative spark, it was a nightmare. Then there's Leonardo DiCaprio, who starred in J. Edgar. By the time he worked with Eastwood, DiCaprio had already collaborated with directors like Scorsese, who meticulously guide every detail of a performance. Eastwood was the complete opposite. He didn't give notes, didn't explain his vision, and often moved on after a single take. For an actor like DiCaprio, who thrives on exploring a character through multiple angles, it felt stifling, like he wasn't being pushed to his full potential. Judi Dench had her own complaints while filming J. Edgar. Known for her classical training and attention to detail, Dench found Eastwood's silence deeply unnerving. She reportedly said it was one of the strangest sets she had ever worked on, because the usual rhythm of filmmaking, action, cut, reset, was missing. Instead, Eastwood simply expected everyone to know when the scene was over. For Dench, it was like working in a vacuum. And it didn't stop there. Matt Damon, who worked with Eastwood on Invictus, once said that Eastwood's sets were so quiet it felt like working in a church. Damon meant it as both a compliment and a criticism. The respect was undeniable, but the tension was always there. Armie Hammer, Damon's co-star, described the experience as unsettling, like Eastwood could cut you down with just a glance if you weren't up to his standards. The pattern is clear. Eastwood's directing style doesn't suit everyone. Some thrive under the freedom, while others feel abandoned without guidance. And when some of the world's most celebrated actors walk away uneasy, it raises a question: was Eastwood being a visionary, or just impossible to work with? But these frustrations on set were nothing compared to what one of Hollywood's greatest actresses endured. In fact, she once revealed that Eastwood barely spoke a single word to her through the making of their entire film together. For most actors, the chance to work with Clint Eastwood is a dream come true. But for Meryl Streep, one of the most decorated actresses in history, the experience turned out to be one of the strangest and most unsettling of her entire career. The two starred together in The Bridges of Madison County, a film that became one of Eastwood's most celebrated dramas. On screen, the chemistry between Streep and Eastwood was undeniable, intimate, emotional, and deeply human. But behind the camera, it was a completely different story. Streep later admitted that throughout filming, Eastwood barely said a single word to her. He didn't offer notes, didn't give encouragement, and often just stared silently while the cameras rolled. Streep, who was used to working with directors that dig into every detail of a performance, was unnerved. She even confessed that she worried something was wrong, that maybe he didn't like her, or maybe her performance wasn't what he wanted. But when she finally confronted him about the silence, Eastwood's answer was chillingly simple: "If I don't say anything, that means you're doing fine." For Streep, it was almost like acting in the dark, unsure if she was moving in the right direction. The irony? The film went on to become one of the defining moments of her career. But the experience left her shaken. It was a reminder of just how cold and distant Eastwood could be, even when he was working side by side with one of the greatest actresses alive. But as strange as Streep's story was, it pales in comparison to Eastwood's turbulent relationship with Sandra Locke. Locke wasn't just a co-star, she was Eastwood's partner for over a decade, both on screen and off. They appeared together in films like The Outlaw Josie Wales and Sudden Impact, and for years, they looked like one of Hollywood's power couples. But behind closed doors, the relationship was far darker than the public ever realized. When their romance fell apart in the late 1980 seconds, Locke accused Eastwood of betrayal on multiple levels. She claimed that after their split, Eastwood used his power in Hollywood to sabotage her career, cutting off opportunities and quietly shutting doors behind the scenes. Lawsuits followed, dragging their personal war into the public eye. Locke alleged that Eastwood manipulated her into signing deals that led nowhere, essentially trapping her in projects designed to fail. For Eastwood, who built his image on stoic independence, it was a rare glimpse into his personal life, and it wasn't flattering. Locke painted a picture of a man who was vindictive, controlling, and willing to destroy someone he once loved in order to maintain power. The lawsuits eventually ended in settlements, but the damage to their relationship was permanent. Locke passed away in 2018, still remembered as both Eastwood's muse and one of the women he treated the harshest. Together, Streep and Locke's stories reveal something many fans overlook. Eastwood may have been a genius on screen and behind the camera, but working with him often came at a heavy emotional cost. And if you think these battles were rough, wait until you hear about the legendary director who once clashed with Eastwood himself, turning a creative partnership into a bitter fallout that fans are still debating today. Before Clint Eastwood became an American icon, he was just a TV actor looking for his big break. That break came when Italian director Sergio Leone cast him in A Fistful of Dollars. At the time, westerns were fading in Hollywood, but Leone's spaghetti westerns changed everything. They were gritty, violent, and stylish, and at the center of it all was Eastwood's cold, mysterious gunslinger. The partnership skyrocketed Eastwood to international fame. A Fistful of Dollars, for a few dollars more. And finally, the good, the bad, and the ugly turned him from a small-screen cowboy into a global star. For many fans, Eastwood and Leone were inseparable, the director and actor who reinvented the Western together. But behind the scenes, the relationship wasn't as perfect as it looked. Leone was known for being controlling, obsessive, and larger than life, while Eastwood was reserved, disciplined, and not the type to stroke a director's ego. As the films grew more successful, Eastwood reportedly grew frustrated with Leone's endless takes and heavy-handed direction. Leone, meanwhile, started to resent Eastwood's stoicism, once commenting that Eastwood had only two expressions, one with the hat and one without it. By the time Leone moved on to Once Upon a Time in the West, he didn't even invite Eastwood to return. Instead, he cast Charles Bronson and Henry Fonda, leaving Eastwood behind. Rumors swirled that their fallout was more than professional, it was personal. Leone felt Eastwood didn't respect him enough, while Eastwood believed he didn't need Leone anymore to keep climbing. The split left fans wondering what could have been. A fourth collaboration between the two could have been legendary, but instead, their partnership ended abruptly, with both men moving on in different directions. Leone continued making epics until his untimely death in 1989, while Eastwood built his own empire as both actor and director. Still, whispers of their feud linger. Even decades later, cinephiles argue about whether Eastwood abandoned the man who made him, or whether Leone underestimated the actor who would go on to dominate Hollywood. And while Eastwood's clashes with Leone stayed mostly behind closed doors, his next conflicts were anything but private. In fact, some of the most heated criticisms came not from co-stars, but from fellow filmmakers, directors who accused Eastwood of glorifying violence, rewriting history, and even erasing voices from the past. Clint Eastwood has never shied away from controversy. His films are unapologetic, often tackling themes of justice, violence, and patriotism in ways that divide critics. For some audiences, he's a master of grit and realism. For others, he's a symbol of outdated, even dangerous ideas. And two of his loudest critics over the years have been directors Spike Lee and Michael Moore. The feud with Spike Lee started when Eastwood directed two World War II films back-to-back, Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima. Both movies focused on the historic Battle of Iwo Jima, told from the American and Japanese perspectives. But Lee pointed out a glaring omission: there were no Black Marines depicted, despite the fact that African-American troops fought and died in the Pacific Campaign. Lee accused Eastwood of whitewashing history, saying it was a deliberate erasure of black soldiers. Eastwood didn't take the criticism quietly. He fired back, insisting that he had stayed faithful to the specific units that raised the famous flag on Iwo Jima, and that rewriting the details just to be politically correct would have been dishonest. But the damage was done. The public feud highlighted a larger issue. Eastwood's vision of history often clashed with those who wanted to see a broader, more inclusive narrative. Then came Michael Moore, who publicly attacked Eastwood after the release of American Sniper. The film, based on the life of Navy SEAL Chris Kyle, became a box office phenomenon, but also a lightning rod for debate. Supporters praised it as a tribute to soldiers, while critics accused it of glorifying war and painting a one-sided picture of the conflict in Iraq. Moore went so far as to label the film propaganda and suggested Eastwood had turned Kyle into a hero, without questioning the darker consequences of his actions. Eastwood, true to form, didn't back down. He dismissed Moore's criticisms and stood firmly by his film, which went on to gross over $500 million worldwide. For Eastwood, critics like Moore and Lee were distractions, loud voices that couldn't shake his confidence in telling the stories the way he wanted. But the very fact that these clashes became so public speaks volumes. While actors like Wayne, Brando, and Streep had personal issues with Eastwood, directors like Lee and Moore turned him into a cultural battleground. To some, he's a genius who reshaped American cinema. To others, he's a stubborn relic whose films reflect an older, harsher worldview. And yet, through every feud, every criticism, and every controversy, Eastwood kept moving forward, refusing to bend, refusing to apologize. Which raises the ultimate question: were these conflicts proof of his flaws, or were they the price of greatness? Looking back at Clint Eastwood's career, it's almost surreal to realize just how many battles he fought along the way. From John Wayne to Marlon Brando, from Meryl Streep to Sandra Locke, and even against directors like Sergio Leone, Spike Lee, and Michael Moore, Eastwood's path through Hollywood is littered with clashes, grudges, and feuds that could have crushed a lesser star. Yet somehow, instead of holding him back, those conflicts only seemed to sharpen his legend. Eastwood never begged for approval. He never apologized for making movies the way he wanted to make them. If an actor didn't like his directing style, he kept rolling. If another legend mocked him, he didn't fire back. He simply outlasted them. And if critics called his work controversial, he wore it as a badge of honor. That silence, that stubborn independence, became his greatest weapon. It's the same cold determination you see in the eyes of his most famous characters, silent, unflinching, and unwilling to bend for anyone. But here's the question that lingers. Was that strength also his weakness? For every brilliant collaboration, there are stories of pain, betrayal, and alienation. Meryl Streep questioning why he wouldn't speak to her, Sandra Locke accusing him of sabotage, John Wayne dismissing his westerns as immoral, and Marlon Brando mocking his very existence. Even in victory, Eastwood often stood alone. And yet, maybe that's exactly why he endured. Hollywood is filled with people-pleasers, with stars desperate to fit into every mold and satisfy every critic. Eastwood was the opposite. He carved his own path, even if it meant making enemies along the way. That refusal to compromise gave him not just longevity, but a reputation as one of the last true mavericks in American cinema. So when we ask, who did Clint Eastwood hate the most? The better question might be, who hated him enough to try to stop him? Because in every story, whether it was Wayne's disapproval, Brando's insult, Streep's frustration, or Locke's heartbreak, Eastwood didn't just survive, he came out bigger, louder, stronger. And in the end, he didn't need to win anyone's love. He only needed to win the audience. And judging by the fact that Clint Eastwood is still making movies well into his 90s, still commanding respect, still sparking debate, and still refusing to quit, he might just have been right all along.